share with someone else. I'll share the link, an unlisted link on YouTube so y'all can see it. So if we are starting, and then Amina, if I'm doing the slides, you can just tell me when to move it, but you should be able to move it as well. Technology is weird. It's this one. Yeah, I think. Let's see. Sharing. Slides showing up.
Yep.
I just did a webinar on Teams, and I don't know if y'all have ever had to use Teams, but it's pretty brutal. My slides froze halfway through, and then my video went off, so they could only hear me do a webinar, which is probably the least appetizing thing, I think. But here we are. So as we discussed in the previous meeting, in order to use the Intercultural Development Inventory tool, we do an overview. We have a window of time where everyone get 6 days to do a 15-20-minute assessment piece. No one knows their individual scores. They're totally confidential. So the way that you find out your individual scores is by scheduling a time on the Google Sheet with Amina, and she's going to talk a little bit more about that process too. But now that everyone on the team has done it, in order for you to see kind of where you fit into the context of how everyone placed or scored, depending on how you want to look at it for the assessment tool, we do a group review. And so since Amina is going to take the lead on the one-on-ones, so that you individually find out your own scores, again, they're totally confidential. No one else will know your scores unless you choose to share it with someone else. And the conversation that you have with Amina is also totally confidential. I won't know any specific details, nor will anyone else in the group. I wanted to make sure that you have all the access to tools and resources to support your own individual personal or professional development, and then how that works together as a team. After Amina's one-on-one kind of window closes, she and I will meet again to then talk about kind of like patterns or recommendations on a high level, nothing specific, as far as kind of what are the next recommendations or moves that could make working as a middle manager, upper manager, management at nowadays better and more inclusive, and working towards all the goals that you're shooting for. So that's kind of the general plan or idea for today, is just to look at that group review and to put your own kind of placement into context with the team that you work with. So Lorna is joining us, so just in time. So I'm going to pass it over to Amina and mute, because I think the mail is here. And Amina, can you see if you can move the slides? You should be able to drive.
I am trying to, so I'm wondering.
If not, you can just boss me around here.
Yeah, I don't think it lets me draw all over it. Sorry. Oops. Okay, so apparently that squiggle is there to stay on every slide. Oops, sorry about that.
There you go. I moved it forward.
I know, but I don't know how to delete the squiggle, so everybody just has to like ignore the squiggle. Okay, so was this core concept the first slide? Okay, awesome. Thank you. All right, thank you so much, everyone, for your time. I know your time is really precious, and so we're going to see if we can get through this pretty quickly and open up for a little bit of discussion at the end. Typically, what I do is like a 90-minute group profile presentation when I'm working with leadership teams. And so we're not going to go into that massive amount of detail, but there's some core things that I want to share with you in relation to the assessment that you all took. So you all took the IDI, Intercultural Development Inventory Assessment. It is not a leadership personality assessment. It is a developmental assessment, and pretty much it measures something called intercultural competence. And I like to share with people my definition of intercultural competence. IDI also shares a very similar definition. Intercultural competence is pretty much the capacity that people have, that we all have. And that capacity of ours, think of it as a muscle. It's built because of the life that we have lived, right? It's built based on whatever lived experience we have been exposed to. Just like when you live on planet Earth, where there is gravity, your muscles develop differently. If you were born and grew up on the moon, where there isn't gravity, I think. I don't know that much science, but I'm pretty sure there isn't, or there is a lot less or different kind of gravity. Your muscle development would be different, right? You would develop very differently. So cultural competence or intercultural competence is your ability to be able to shift perspectives, shift behaviors based on the commonalities and differences that you experience with others. And the more intercultural competent you are, the more levels of complexity you can bring to those interactions than if you're not. So if you're very low on your intercultural competence, I don't know, think of someone like Trump. He can't bring a ton. He's very polarized. Everything is black and white, right? Everything is right or wrong. Everything is good or bad. And he knows exactly which ones are right and wrong, what's right and what's wrong. So the more complexity you bring to your interactions with people as you interact with things that you hold in common, things that you have differences across, that is called intercultural competence. I like sharing this diagram because I like to show, because we're going to talk about diversity and multicultural teams, and I want to make sure we understand the relationship between diversity, inclusion, and intercultural competence. A lot of times employers or leaders, the misconception they have is that, well, for me to be an inclusive organization, I just need to increase the number of different people at my organization. I just need to recruit for diversity. That is going to make me an inclusive organization. And I tell people, imagine the intercultural competence piece or the wheel not being present in this image. Diversity wheel and the inclusion wheel do not interconnect. They're not connected with each other. They cannot drive each other. So when you increase diversity, that doesn't increase inclusion. Very often it does the opposite. You have a really high spike in retention loss because you haven't done the work to make sure that the diversity is going to feel at home, that is going to be connected to something that's going to turn the inclusion wheel. So diversity on its own does not produce inclusion. What you need is something called intercultural competence. And so when you think about teams and groups, the more interculturally competent a group or a team is, the better that wheel is going to move and turn. And the better that the wheel moves and turns, it actually engages diversity and inclusion and produces inclusion. So these are interconnected, and that's how I like to describe this concept. The other thing I'll just say is, like, I am centering intercultural competence as a key core muscle when it comes to inclusive leadership skills. There are, in my theory and framework, 6 other competencies that are important to have. So it doesn't mean that just because you are interculturally competent that automatically inclusion is going to be driven. There are other factors. I'm simplifying it for the purpose of this assessment and talking about this assessment. All right, you can go to the next slide. All right, so the assessment that you all took, they have a framework. So IDI has a framework. It's called the Intercultural Development Continuum. And it's an arrow pointing upwards towards the right-hand side, because what they want to convey is that, and the arrow gets wider, right? So what they want to convey is that the more right to the right that you move on the continuum, the larger your capacity for intercultural competence. The more left you are, the smaller the capacity for that. And the arrow points to the right because the goal is that you want to move towards the right. It is a continuum, and it's a developmental continuum. What this means is that even though when you took the assessment and you meet with me one-on-one and you get your results, and let's say, let's say your results are like in minimization, let's say, that's just what you got measured for when you took that assessment. That doesn't mean that there aren't situations in life where you show up in acceptance in your life, or where you show up in adaptation, or where you show up in denial or polarization, right? And so I, for example, measure in adaptation, but when I am going to have a conversation with a husband about loading the dishwasher, I become very polarized. It's just going to be very honest, right? And so I tell people that it's a continuum. This is not a static, your results are not going to be static. It just means that predominantly, this is the large strength of your muscle. This is where you predominantly lie. When you are at any stage, the other thing I want to mention before I move on is that we all go through all of these 5 stages. So there isn't a right and wrong stage. This is a developmental stage. Think of this as learning to speak, speak period, actually, forget language, learning to speak, or learning to walk. When you're a kid or an infant, you're going to begin with a lower level skill and you're going to increase to the right. So when we're all born, there's a lot of, when kids eat food for the first time, they make really ugly faces, even when they like try pop, which is supposed to taste good, I know, to most people, or sweets, they make this really bizarre face because they are experiencing a difference and they are trying to figure out how to orient themselves to it. And so we all move through the stages in our lifespans, and the goal is like that by the time I get to half my life, maybe 3/4 of my life, that I've had the ability to, based on lived experiences and reflection and my own sustained intentional work, be able to get to a place where I'm in adaptation. IDI does have a 6th stage. After adaptation, there's integration, and I can't tell you why they don't add it to the continuum for the public to see. I just want you to know that's not the last stage. There is another stage past adaptation, and that will become useful when we talk about going to the continuum in a bit more detail. All right, next slide. Did you want to add anything to that, Jess, to that slide? No? Okay. When you meet with me one-on-one, your results are going to look like this little square that I added here. IDI will tell you you have a perceived orientation. This means this is how you perceive your competencies. So this person who took this assessment, their results show them that they perceive that they are partway through acceptance. Kind of a little past middle of acceptance is what they perceive their competencies to be. But then IDI also says that their actual orientation, which is what they call developmental orientation, so their actual orientation is a little shy of middle of minimization, right? And then it shows them that you have a gap. There is a gap between your perception of your intercultural competency and where you actually lie. And that gap is called the orientation gap, right? I tell people that developmental orientation, your actual orientation, is actually how others experience you. So perceived orientation is how you experience yourself and how you think you're showing up. Developmental orientation is how other people experience you. And you're supposed to have a gap. You're supposed to so when it comes to soft skills, especially, right? You're supposed to have a gap where you're supposed to perceive your skill to be a little higher, because this is how we grow better, because we shoot for a higher place on the mountain, because that's what we're aiming towards. The other reason this is true is because of something called the Dunning-Kruger effect, and that is that, like, especially when it comes to soft skills, like compassion, deep listening, intercultural competence, emotional resilience, these skills, they're hard for you yourself to gauge accurately what your skills are, because they are skills that are relational. Because the only way for you to know this skill is to engage, interact with other people and to get feedback back, right? If I just have a monologue with myself, I'm gonna be like, great, I'm culturally competent, I'm emotionally resilient, I didn't get mad at myself, right? That's just me, that's the inner me dialogue, right? So it's a relational skill, compared to, like, I can't think of anyone who would ever overestimate their ability to fly an airplane, or their ability to put on a pair of ice skates and hop onto an ice rink. I know I'm going to fall flat. I'm never going to attempt it. So I will never overestimate that skill of mine, because the way to test that skill is really instant and really fast. But these skills, testing them is really hard. And the only way to test them is to figure out, like, how your relationships are going. And those are hard to gauge. It's hard to find accurate mirrors in our life, right? And that's what the IDI is serving as. It's serving as a mirror to say, this is your perceived, this is your actual, and here's your orientation gap. And then it gives you a development plan to say, here's how you can improve on your development, your skills. Anything else, Jess? No? All right. As a group, when we're meeting today, you're going to see your group results. So these are not your group results. These are not your group results. This is just a sample from a different group. Basically, there are 2 types of teams. You can find teams that have people who fall in all 5 orientations. They have a wide range of cultural competencies, and that team, what they have to do to figure out how to increase their collective capacity to have intercultural competence will be a little different compared to a team that everybody fell in minimization and polarization, for example, right? That's a very narrow range. The benefit of having a wide range, especially wide range that's top heavy, so wide range that has people in adaptation and acceptance, is that as a team, you have access to people who have those skills, and you can lean on them to pull your collective capacity to the higher end. The challenge when you have a narrow range, and when that narrow range is absent of anybody in adaptation and acceptance, is like, well, how are you going, what is going to be your developmental plan collectively and individually to give yourself access to knowing how to show up in adaptation and acceptance if nobody has that skill or that muscle built, right? And so like your strategy for how you're going to develop your skills is going to be very different based on whether you have a narrow range or a wide range for your group results. The other thing that's really very beneficial to see group results beyond just your individual results is to be able to design. So I, as a consultant, like what I do is I use this as insight to tell myself, okay, if a team is falling mostly in minimization and polarization, I'm not going to provide them with academic level anti-racism training. I'm just not going to, because it's developmentally inappropriate. It's like asking a child who has not learned how to walk to hop onto a treadmill. It's not going to work. It's going to fall flat. You're going to have a lot of backlash. It's going to crush. It's one of the reasons why DEI fails a lot, is that it doesn't meet people where they are. The other reason DEI fails is when you have people on your team. So if you look at the wider range, when you have people on your team who are in adaptation and acceptance, and all they're doing is implicit bias trainings, so like aiming for trainings that are developmentally appropriate for people in polarization and denial, but not actually meeting people in adaptation acceptance. And so it leaves those people behind. Another reason why DEI ends up failing. So you have backlash, it fails eventually. Right. And so that's the other reason. I just want you to know, like, I want you to have that in the back of your mind as you look at your team results. It helps us figure out what recommendations can be made in terms of like how to move forward in your development plan.
Well,
I don't know about, yeah, you can pop in. I don't know about anybody else, but my scribble is bothering me so much.
Oh, I'm sorry. I would have to unshare, go delete it, and then share again.
No,
I think
don't
that'd
do
be
it.
too
Don't do it.
distracting. I think it's cute. Let's just
Okay.
what I was gonna add is that after meeting with talking with some people and then meeting with y'all on that Tuesday, we kind of got to a place of like moving forward and being less shitty, right? Like so the goal is not very high, but also we're able to come together in a way of moving forward that was enjoyable. So now what do we do? So instead of just coming in prescriptive and being like, well, here's the top 10 things that work with every organization, to Amina's point, I don't know who really is on the management team, right? Other than we sat in a circle together for a while. So part of the reason I recommended this assessment tool first was to be able to determine as a group, where are the skill sets that exist here before making recommendations about where to go forward, so that it's much more specific to your needs instead of just what most organizations need. What I love about being able to collaborate with another consultant is Amina and I both are coming at our two nowadays from different levels of connection or experience or engagement with each one of you. And so then we have fresh eyes, but we're also bringing all of our history of working with different consulting clients together to be able to develop some recommendations that fit you because they're your recommendations instead of kind of generic best practices. So that's why we started here. So you ready for the next one, Amina?
I am. So drum roll, here are your results. So as a team, you all have something in between a wide and narrow range, right? So you have a few folks who are in adaptation, but the bulk of the team is falling in the acceptance developmental orientation and the minimization development orientation, right? What this means is you have people on your team who know from lived experience how to show up to commonalities and differences with complexity. And then you have then a significant number of people on the team who in their developmental stage are at the place where they have learned to mask difference as the way to get out of polarization, right? Get out of because we all begin early on in our lives and we move up on the developmental continuum. And so when you're in minimization, this is the stage where you're masking difference. Would you go back to the continuum so I can I can actually refer to the little things at the top, right? So minimization is the stage where you de-emphasize difference, right? That is how you show up to differences. You get along with people by focusing on commonalities. Acceptance is a stage where an understanding, the ability to understand difference has started to occur, depending on where you are in that acceptance stage, because it's a range. When you're in acceptance, so when you're in minimization, the challenge is to engage with difference. The challenge is to be able to work through discomfort, put yourself in those places where discomfort shows up around differences that make you uncomfortable, right? We're not talking about pizza toppings. I'll say a little bit about difference in a bit. That's what the challenge is for people in minimization. For people in acceptance, the challenge is they are able to see difference. They no longer judge difference, because in polarization, you judge difference. They no longer judge difference. They no longer mask difference. So they've built the ability not to have to mask difference. There isn't discomfort with it. But the challenge is that because they are accepting of all difference, they don't know what action to take. So there's a lot of action paralysis for people who are in the acceptance stage. And that acceptance paralysis shows up in one of two ways or both ways. It shows up in the I don't know what to do, right? And it also shows up in the when people tell you what to do, you still don't know how to do it. So the what and the how are both missing, and that is a challenge and the growth opportunity for people in acceptance. When you're in adaptation, you are very familiar with difference. They don't make you uncomfortable, and your understanding of difference has moved on to a place where you know now how to bridge across that difference. You know how to take some actions. You know how to incorporate other people or that particular difference into your culture or your way of being, right? So you know how to be more inclusive. The last stage that is not shown on this diagram is called integration. And integration is where you know how to incorporate and leverage that difference pragmatically, right? This is not I'm not referring to what brands do with marketing, where they find a difference and they co-opt it for the purpose of making money. Not that kind of leveraging. So not exploitative leveraging, but leveraging the difference to integrate it so that that difference is no longer a difference, actually. Right? I tell people that when I meet someone in integration, I know right away because of a very key phrase that they use differently than other people. When you are in minimization or polarization, people say, I have met lots of people who are different from me. I've had experience. I've met people who are different from me. I'm not uncomfortable with people who are different with me. By the time you get to integration, the mindset has changed to the point where you realize difference is relational. There's no such thing as difference unless it's relational. And so I have met people I am different from. So you locate the difference in yourself. And so you orient towards difference in a very different way, in that you see yourself as someone who's housing difference versus it always being in someone else in the outside world. If that makes sense. You want to go back to the group results? Awesome. The good news is so from my really short time with you all, like just visually seeing you are not a monocultural team. You are a multiracial team. You're not predominantly white, so racially. So I know that there are other dimensions of our identities, but you are not a monocultural team. And so it's not surprising to me. Plus, you all live in New York, or around that area. And I'm guessing you come to life with lived experiences that are broader than just growing up in predominantly like segregated spaces, the way that US geography is designed. And so you don't have anybody who is in polarization and denial. That's like, I think, like a positive thing about your narrow range is your narrow range is top heavy, not bottom heavy. And so, yeah, so those are your group results. I'm trying to see if there was something else that I wanted to say. I don't think I want to say anything just yet. You want to go to the next one?
Sure. I was going to ask a question. When we were talking in preparation, because most of my clients that aren't the full scale, most of my clients are almost always in denial, polarization, and minimization, so bottom heavy. And so when full disclosure, I guess, so when Amina and I were talking about what does it mean when a team is more top heavy, because there are those skills there. One of the things that was really powerful that kind of aligned with some of the conversations we had on that Tuesday training is that Amina, if I'm getting ahead, just tell me, yeah, it's coming. But the idea of conflict, or the idea of kind of the leadership vacuum, is that when there are more skills present, then anybody could be doing the leading. And when that's not happening, then somebody else could be doing the leading. And that was a very interesting shift for me, working with teams who are mostly in denial, polarization, and minimization, because there is a decisive order that is not flexible or adjustable as to whose responsibility is to be doing something. And it's not arguable. People might not like it. They might have a judgment about it or an opinion about it, but it's a framework that is immovable. Whereas top heavy, the framework is being developed together in a more collaborative way, even if there's kind of a vacuum as to who's doing what. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, so like what I had pointed out to you was that what happens often is that when you are in adaptation and acceptance stages of the developmental orientations, your challenge and growth opportunity tends to be knowing how to bridge across the difference of the orientations. It's like figuring out how actually to get shit done with people who are in minimization or polarization and denial. And so people in adaptation and acceptance often express a lot of frustration. And so so what I'll say is, to add on to what you're saying, because you know the group better than I do, what I'll say is the kind of conflicts that shows up when there's this kind of a narrow range versus a bottom heavy narrow range is very different. So the conflict that shows up is different. The quality of that conflict usually is different. How conflict gets resolved is usually different. Which is why I love doing the IDIs, because like typically mediation, ADR, other type of like consensus-based modules of conflict resolution, they work for people, for a team of group of people who are in minimization, polarization, denial. They do not work for people that end up with your range, because this is a group of people that wants emergence. You want collaboration, you want emergence. And so trying to use tools that are not developmentally appropriate for your skill sets tend to get frustrating, because you have different skill sets, you have different muscles, and the desire to do things differently is there. So we'll talk a little bit about that when we talk about difference. Yeah, that's a good observation. Want to go to the next one? This was a diagram this is one of IDI's diagram. They have done research. So they have a lot of research and a lot of case studies on their website. A lot of it doesn't make sense to me because I'm not the academic type. I really just look for practical stuff. But I like this diagram because what it shows is basically you have them showing that for the most part, when you survey teams across the US and Canada, most teams are monocultural. So that's where you have that yellow bell curve in the middle. And it's higher than the two red bell curves because the number of teams that exist across the continent are predominantly monocultural. Okay. When you have teams that are multicultural, their performance is lower than monocultural teams. Their performance is lower based on whether or not they are interculturally competent, if they are actually leveraging that muscle. So when teams have high intercultural competence and they know how to actually use their intercultural competence, they perform better. when they're not, they have a lot of conflict and they don't perform better. And why that is because when you have multicultural teams where leaders, their way of keeping peace is to ignore differences and to suppress cultural differences, those teams are going to perform less. Why? Because you're creating an environment where people aren't feeling belonging, right? When people don't want to be somewhere, they're not going to perform. And so difference becomes an obstacle to team performance. But when you have leaders who know how to acknowledge difference, they know how to understand difference, they know how to bridge across difference, they know how to integrate difference, those are the teams that perform better, because the leaders know how to make belonging a norm, and they don't have to like artificially like manufacture it by increasing diversity. I just thought this was a nice slide for you to see. And let's see.
Sorry.
I thought there was another slide. Is it gone? 1 second.
This was-
That was it. Okay. This is just an overview of the different mindsets, a little description, you know, showing you like what is the dominant skill set in that orientation, and then organizational like implications that are drawn. And so if I go to the 3 where you all landed, minimization, like I said, there's an overemphasis on commonality. These are the work cultures where we're all the same, we're all one human race, we all need to be kind, we all need to work together. There's an emphasis on commonality to avoid engaging with difference, to keep peace, and to try to get people to get along. There is some cultural self-awareness, but that cultural self-awareness is lacking and needs to be built, right? Because when you're in minimization as a collective, as a group of people, everything is measured based on commonalities. So because there's an overemphasis on commonalities, norms are what are revered. And when somebody breaks a norm, that person does something that makes everybody uncomfortable. So norms are highly emphasized. And norms are highly emphasized in places where you don't have a cultural self-awareness. That's a low cultural self-awareness behavior. Because if you are aware of your cultural self, you will know that those are particular to you and that they don't, your identities or characteristics are not to be used as a yardstick to create a norm, right? And so building cultural awareness is an intervention or a skill that needs to be built. Organizational implication. There tends to be a lot of acceptance of institutionalized privilege. It's not questioned because that would be questioning a norm, and that skill doesn't exist. So that's one thing to think about. When people as a collective are in acceptance, they recognize cultural difference, they see the difference, right? There's curiosity that needs to be developed so that they can engage more with differences in a way where you're trying to figure out what to do with it versus just learn, right? So when people move from minimization and acceptance, they move from one stage to the other by saying to themselves and by doing things like, I want to learn more about other cultures. I want to expose myself to different foods. I want to expose myself to different musics. I want to go to different movies. I want to attend theater. I want to XYZ. And so there's this like desire for learning, but not knowing what to do with all of that learning. And so the curiosity needs to be piqued in a different way. And like I said, ability to analyze implications of power and privilege. So these people learn how to speak the language of power and privilege. They know how to regurgitate what they learn. So they're very good at regurgitating, but they have a really hard time figuring out what to do, how to take action, how to turn things into principles, how to turn things into policies, how to change procedures, and that kind of stuff. Adaptation is where you're good at shifting perspective and behavior. You know how to hold a belief, but also shift your perspective and behavior based on interacting with someone who does not hold a particular belief. An intervention skill that you could work on is empathy and frame shifting. Adaptation is where the skill tends to be to take risks, meaning engaging with differences that will cost you. So I'm trying to think of like a good example for this. So Target is a good example. So when Target is often known for doing really like good inclusive stuff, and they're very pro LGBTQ. But when the anti-trans bills were being pushed, and there were Targets in the South that had a lot of vandalism taking place in their stores, their response was to take down LGBTQ paraphernalia signs and stuff like that. That was their coping mechanism. So that was them reverting back to something in between minimization and acceptance, right? So they sometimes display adaptation behavior, but they didn't know how to actually engage with the difference in a way to align themselves with their values and to be able to ground the heels down and be able to like stick to their principles, values. They shifted. So risk taking and knowing how to take smart risks is something that is a skill that needs to be built in adaptation. Changes in policy and practice. So changes in policy and practice are risk-taking actions, by the way. Because anytime you change a structure of a culture, you're going to go against what everybody thinks or what predominantly people think of as a norm. And organizational focus tends to be equity. So this was just an overview of those 5 stages. Was that the last stage? Last slide?
Yeah, we're just over time, so I want to be sensitive, but I know that that's also a lot of information. So before we get to kind of like don't forget to go to this Google Sheet and schedule a one-on-one with Amina, are there thoughts or comments or questions or ideas or anything while the group is together? And then obviously you get a one-on-one session with Amina to talk specifically about your individual results and what your development plan would be and what that looks like in your own individual life. But
would you go back to their team results? Like, I'd love to know, like, as you heard me talk at you for 30 minutes, any thoughts, any reflections, anything occurred to you, any moments, light bulbs? You can come off mute or you can put it into
James, it looks like you're trying to say something, but we can't hear you. It's not muted, it's just possibly the sound source. It's not working. Weird.
So now you're muted, now you're unmute.
You can put it in the chat or the source. If you go to the little caret on the audio, that might help. It might be like hooked up to your headphones or something that you're not using. While James is getting that kind of situated, any other thoughts or comments or impressions or ideas?
I have a question on the perceived versus the actual rating. Is that only measured on an individual basis, or is that also measured on a group basis?
That is measured on a group basis, actually, right? Let me quickly check. I'm going to do a quick check.
I think it creates like an average.
I'm pretty sure it gives you a perceived of the group as well, difference. It does. I forgot to put that screenshot in. That's why I was thinking there was another screenshot. So I'm going to quickly share that screen with you if I can.
Yep.
Okay. Great question, Eamon. All right, so here it is. So the orientation gap, right, between perceived and your actual as a collective is 12.69 points. IDI says that anything above 7 points is a significant difference. Significant difference meaning you should do something to work to bridge that gap. Now, having said that, it's not a massive gap. I've seen people, individuals, where that gap is like 100, right? So that gap could be a lot bigger, but just letting you know that this is what it is for your collective. They average it out.
Okay, thank you.
Yep, you're welcome.
James, do you want to see if you got your audio fixed? No.
Or James,
right.
you could also just type your question into the chat if that helps. If you've got
Do you think
access.
I don't want to do that?
I know it's hard to do it on a phone. Other
Or-
thoughts or comments?
That PD, I saw you shaking your head, nodding your head, and I was wondering if you were thinking of something.
No, just really taking it in. I think more questions for the one-on-one, definitely. But yeah.
James, you want to try it one more time? Nope.
It's kind of a bummer.
Sorry. All right. Well, because I want to be respectful of the time, I want to make sure that I'm flashing through these. I hope it doesn't give you a headache. The link to the Google Sheet to schedule a one-on-one with Amina is in the same email that had all your directions on accessing the assessment tool. I'm happy to also put it in the chat. There's a number of you calling in from the phone, so you can't really access the chat, but it's in all of the same email where you successfully got the codes in order to do the assessment. You just go to the one-on-one page, pick whatever date and time. Amina has a giant list that's available. I'd suggest doing it sooner than later so that Amina can kind of like free up her life again instead of like blocking all this time for y'all's one-on-ones. And then when that window is closed, Amina and I will meet to talk about kind of high-level recommendations, and we'll see where y'all take those recommendations. They might involve other people, they might involve particular tasks or activities for you to do. We might be done, we might not be done. Who knows? We'll see what happens. And then separate, because there has been some confusion, the one-on-one with Amina is specific to the assessment tool. And along the journey, you are welcome to schedule time with me if you need support along the way. I'm happy to be supportive of you or how things are feeling or landing as you're kind of going through this while also working and being part of this team. If there's anything I can do, you can use Trojan Seahorse to schedule 30 minutes with me. I tend to talk a lot, so I recommend 60 minutes, and that's at Trojan Unicorns. Otherwise, Amina is waiting for you to sign up for your one-on-ones, and we'll wait until those are kind of done, which I think the last one is July 30th. No, July 3rd, I think.
Yeah, third.
3rd, yeah, not the 30th, sorry. And if that's helpful, let me know. There looks like I'm gonna stop sharing for just a second. I'm gonna
So-
put the link in the chat.
That. And then
And-
James had put his comment in the Q&A section, which I did not realize Zoom had. Haha.
Great.
But basically, he is saying, and I hope I'm understanding you right, that you want more on management practices that are beneficial for low tiers but unproductive for higher tiers.
Oh, I'm happy to speak with that too. I mean, Amina, you mentioned some of it, but when because most of my clients tend to be in denial polarization, to use that as a kind of cliff note example, when someone scores typically in denial, or maybe you're higher, but like you retreat back into your denial space. I like to think of these as when I have an immersive weekend. I don't know if any of you, some of you are getting ready to go on vacation, but if you've ever like kind of taken yourself out of the complicated mess that you live in, and then you go to some special little bubble place, and you know you're in that special little bubble place because you have to re-enter when you leave. I don't know if y'all are familiar with that feeling of like, oh, I just wish I was there. I mean, even the AIDS ride was just recently, so that's a really great example. So I was in this kind of like bubble of a community that I knew all the cultural norms, I knew exactly what to do, I knew the traditions, I knew the language, I knew everything. And then leaving that bubble, I had to kind of like enter the complicated world again. Some people, that is how they live their life, that they don't interact with enough difference or anything different than them to even be able to identify what is so common in their life. So they might score kind of in the denial range. And then polarization, to get out of that place or to develop skills, is to recognize differences. And so instead of like, oh, there's a whole nother world out there. Sometimes that happens when you go on vacation or you meet somebody new or you eat something different. Something kind of trips and you realize that there's a difference. So then polarization is kind of my way and the other way. There might only be kind of two options. And typically in that space, I talked a little bit about this on Tuesday too, is you either get really defensive of your way and that new way that you just found out about is totally wrong, or you become very protective of the new way and you don't like the way that you came from because like now you have found this new thing that's better. That tends to be kind of the polarization stage. And to develop out of that is to actually begin to see some commonalities, even from these new ways. And so when Amin and I were talking the other day, when my clients come at a all lives matter place, they're actually really proud of themselves that they have gotten to a place of understanding the commonalities because they've spent so much time at how different that neighborhood is versus this neighborhood. So to be able to bridge and see a commonality is actually a growth for them, even though that growth is awful and terrible and not in this context is not the time to be flying an all lives matter flag. So it doesn't land well, but it's also a skill development at the same time. So James, to your question, when I am working with groups that tend to score more low on the continuum, it's recognizing what they have done to insulate themselves from experiencing anything they are unfamiliar with. Then when that one time they did experience something different, did they like it or hate it? And then how did they bring those skills forward to also be able to kind of notice what those commonalities are, to then eventually get to a place where you're not so judging of those differences, but you actually are able to see how your differences are showing up instead of it just being additive into your life, like Amina said. So management, supervision, leadership, promotion, even putting someone on probation or not giving someone a promotion. A lot of the times it's recognizing the discomfort someone has of getting out of their comfort zone. So those are kind of the skills or management practices that might be beneficial for someone who's scoring more on the lower side. And to Amina's point, if I were to do exactly that same thing to a team that is scoring like y'all, primarily on the right side, you'd be bored out of your mind. It would be missing the mark constantly because you don't need that kind of rudimentary basics. Unless you've retreated back to that place, and then you can very quickly get back to where your skills might be. Is that helpful, James? And you might have to put in the chat or nodding thumbs up, that works.
I basically tell clients that like how you move from one stage to the next is there's like a few things you work on. You have to build self and other awareness. So self-awareness, other awareness. And in each of the stages, like that work is continuous. It's like this is forever work. Building self-awareness and other awareness is it doesn't just end. There's not a finite amount of self and other awareness building that happens. So that's like when I'm working with my coaching clients, we are working on that based on where they are in their life. Trying to figure out like how conflicts and problems are faced and solved in your life is another place where you figure out how to develop the skills to move from one stage to the next. And then how emotionally literate you are, and what is your emotional resilience, right? So how emotionally regulated do you remain, for example, in conflict? That's another skill. So that's another muscle that helps you move from one stage to the next. And especially by the time you get to acceptance, to move, it usually takes people the longest to go from acceptance to adaptation. And part of that is because we live in a world where we don't have a lot of adaptation and integration behaviors modeled. Mm-hmm. Our school system doesn't model it. Our parents don't model it because they also grow up in the same world. So part of that is because that is what we're exposed to, the limited skills that we are learning from our society around us. And the other part of that is because by the time you get to acceptance, there's a lot of self-awareness, and sometimes that self-awareness can mask as well, but I am fine. I know how to engage with difference. And so learning how to like develop deeper reflection skills and making sure you know how to like, by the time you get to adaptation, for example, knowing how to engage with anger, frustration, grievances, conflict from people who are from minoritized groups. That's the skill that gets you from acceptance to move to adaptation, and from adaptation to integration, is knowing how to receive anger, frustration from people who have less power than you. And so there's a lot of power literacy learning that happens when you are in acceptance or adaptation to move beyond those two stages.
Amina, is there anywhere where we could read more about the individual stages, just on our
Yeah,
on our
you're-
own?
Yeah, so when you meet with me one-on-one, I give you a report at the end, and that report is gonna have like that more details.
Right. Okay. Is there anything we can read in advance? Like I think I'm really
Um,
understanding here, but I have this curiosity to kind of really delve into, like, for instance, minimization and like, like just a deeper understanding of it.
I know that it sounds counterintuitive, but it's usually recommended to kind of start the delving with your one-on-one conversation, because what happens, like, I can forward you some PDFs, you could Google some stuff, but you're going to read and interpret what you are reading and interpreting from how you're scoring on the assessment. And a qualified administrator is much more able to say, like, now notice how you're interpreting that and how it links to your assessment placement, if that makes any sense.
Yep.
And frankly, it's how we bribe you to do the one-on-ones. So highly recommend you do your one-on-one with Amina.
Love it. Okay.
Highly recommend.
Yeah.
You can
I think
schedule
8 of
it
you-
earlier. There's
8 of
slots
you-
tomorrow.
Yeah, 8 of you have scheduled. There's only 4 people who need to hop in and put their names on, and then I'll send out the invites to everyone. I also, IDI has a video, and suggest you might want to send people the video of the continuum, because the continuum video also goes in a little bit more detail on each of the stages.
Sure.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, to be respectful of everyone's time, thank you again for logging in on a Tuesday. I know you have other things that you need to be doing, and I really appreciate it. And if I can help in any way, feel free to schedule time with me. Otherwise, the next step is really to schedule a meeting with Amina. So thank you so much.
Thank you both. Appreciate you taking the time.
Okay.
Take care.
Jennifer, I'll be right there. I'm just finishing a meeting. Okay. Bye, y'all.
Thank you.
Bye.
Jennifer, I'm actually going to stop Zoom and reopen the window.